Since you loved the last video responding to your questions on CTMU metaphysics, we're back with another video. We'll just jump right into it. Why does telesis exist? Telesis subsists in itself. It is the ground and source of being. It is the fundamental stuff of reality. In creation, it's its self-restriction from unbound telesis to bound telesis. Its reason is intrinsic, but it serves to express its teleology, self-identification, through cross-definition of law and state through telic recursion. How does the CTMU define evil? Anti-teleology, i.e. against the intrinsic end and purpose of the universe. Evil takes on a personal form in the egregore sometimes called Satan, from the Hebrew for adversary. Is Christianity the language that best expresses reality? The CTMU does not support everyone converting to Christianity, but rather shows that all religions share the same core structure and are articulating the same ultimate truth, which faithfully mirrors Christianity. While Christ is a universal figure and should be properly recognized by everyone as such, people must also recognize the spiritual insights of every culture and religion, not just Christianity. Christ is universal. Christianity is not necessarily. For example, Catholicism is not, and actually has a number of problems. Is the future of religion bleak? CTMU metaphysics proves the existence of God in many of the truth claims of various religions. There's actually been a big return to religion, and atheists, nuns, are a declining group. The CTMU backs faith up with an unbreakable meta-logic and can lead to the resurgence of religion and the rekindling of the dormant creative fire of humanity. The motif of the modern era is a competition among many religious ideas, even those who claim to be scientific and rationalists, and the best ideas will ultimately win. It's not a question of whether religion survives, but which religion survives. If there is a parasitic divergence, the religion which survives will probably be a one-world hive with everyone as worker ants for a financial oligarchy, and probably some version of the mechanistic materialism which now dominates academia, media, and popular culture. If the CTMU prevails, we will have a meta-religion, which can logically interpret the various faiths in the CTMU, rationally justify their existence and value, affirm human dignity and sovereignty, and preserve the best of all religious and cultural traditions. In short, an interesting and exciting world. If the oligarchs have their way, everyone will be mixed-race, androgynous vegans with no faith. Faith with evidence is what the CTMU brings to the table. This alone entitles it to a place in the ongoing religious debate. What are the gaps in the CTMU theory? The gaps are in resolution, not scope. The CTMU is the theory of everything in a metaphysical sense. It explains what reality is and what our relationship to it is. Because it forms the basis for logic and truth itself, the gaps aren't things which can't be explained by the CTMU, but instead things which haven't yet been explained by the CTMU. What does the CTMU say about the rapture? The CTMU rejects the concept of the rapture, which is nowhere to be found in the Bible. CTMU eschatology instead posits the idea of a parasitic divergence versus the omega point, where the lives and fates of every person on the planet will be either directed by a self-interested financial oligarchy or according to an understanding of our expansive spiritual identity in CTMU metaphysics, and thus fairly and rationally distributed. This does not take any faith or even especially clear. It's pretty much right out there at this point. We are thus, according to Chris Langen, approaching a bifurcation into a human and tech singularity, where we as a species get to choose our destinies. Chris Langen has a good video on the idea of the rapture and why it's basically a scam, causing people to become complacent about human destiny. Are human beings more moral than God? God is the ground and source of all being, and as the expression of his absolute knowledge and power allows us free will so that he can extend and renew and refine his identity and being and goodness further than his own self-relation into a communal universe through the reality self-simulation. In no way does this lessen his goodness or power, especially relative to us who often sin and louse things up. In fact, it strengthens it. Who is Satan in the CTMU? Satan is the egregore of evil. An egregore is the non-terminal being given rise to by the thoughts and behaviors of masses of individuals. In the words of Christian thinker Matthew Pageau, principalities have physically incarnated into groups of individuals to form highly organized conspiracies. Satan is the overall coherence and spiritual reality behind that evil and that conspiracy. God has to remain pure and invariant, and so he has a tight logical boundary around himself. Think of Satan as the negation of God and the metaphysical identity of evil. Langen defines evil as anti-logos, anti-existence, anti-teleology, and its instantiation as the willful and destructive amplification of destruction and negativity, especially against innocent people. truth, beauty, goodness, and the cancellation of positive futures for others. Satan refers to the personality of evil, which takes on a life of its own and can acquire evil humans as resources to do its bidding, such as international bankers, the owners of financial and technological capital, high-profile politicians, billionaires, and other pawns and useful idiots. Satan has no personality or coherent existence of his own. He merely leeches and parasitizes off of God's creation. What is the CTMU's critique of capitalism? The CTMU has a vision for society which transcends all current economic systems: capitalism, socialism, Keynesianism, communism, etc. As I'm sure you know, Chris Langan has been very critical of monopoly capitalism, which he sees as leading to a globalist, technocratic, totalitarian society, and the automatic concentration of human utility and all financial and technological resources in the hands of a parasitic elite, including central bankers, who are the ultimate beneficiaries of capitalism. Obviously, this is not acceptable as the globally dominant economic system, and we must make substantial changes to our finance and economics to achieve true planetary unification. What is the origin of God in the CTMU? As hard as it is to imagine, God doesn't have an origin. Time and causation are internal to him, not categories according to which he is defined. In the words of St. Thomas Aquinas, God is ipsum esse subsistens, the sheer act of being itself. Is the eighth dimensional quasi-crystal described in Clee Irwin's emergence theory, God bless him, creating a quantum simulation of our universe? Yes, in a way, to the extent that his formulation of these concepts corresponds to Chris Langan's CTMU. In fact, Irwin has been known to directly and shamelessly plagiarize Langan's ideas, including the term reality self-simulation, which Langan had used in his papers for decades before Clee Irwin's 2018 paper by that title. But this is explained, the reality self-simulation is explained far more rigorously by the conspansive manifold, the reality self-simulation, and quantum mechanics ideas in the CTMU than by Irwin's quasi-crystal. The idea is that the dynamics of the conspansive manifold, a mathematical/geometric structure that reflects the nature and evolution of reality as it evolves over time, gives rise to a reality self-simulation. The universe is therefore characterized as a self-simulation by, for, and through ultimate reality. Reality is an identity operator that identifies with itself through the process of creation and then attributes existence to its own identity. In the CTMU, God is called the GOD, the global operator descriptor of this reality self-simulation. The internal logic of the self-simulation is through the metaformal system, an intrinsic language that reality uses to communicate with itself. The fundamental moderating force in reality is the intention and will of God, called telesis in the CTMU, the fundamental stuff of reality, which also creates order in the cosmos through recursive cross-definition. What are your thoughts on Islam? I always try to stress that the point of subjecting religions, at least in their present form, to logical analysis in the CTMU is to bring out the best of them. In his interview with Keith Woods, Chris Langan says the CTMU is a, quote, meta-religious framework for the logical reconciliation of various faiths by coupling faith and knowledge. Logos is likened to a pot of well-aerated soil from which the beauty of any faith must be grounded and from which it can flourish. In the Muslim tradition, I am particularly inspired by the Sufi tradition and the Quran, as opposed to the oral tradition and modern institutional forms of Islam, which are, of course, corrupted by human politics. Do Christianity and Judaism support apostasy and genocide? What did Jesus say when he said he came to fulfill the law? When Jesus says he came to fulfill the law and the prophets, it means that he fulfilled the prophecies in the Old Testament and embodies God's teleology and commandment as a special secondary image identified with the fullness of his being in creation. Never once does Jesus endorse religious compulsion or genocide. Can the same be said for Islam? Instead, Langan notes in his article, Logos, Jesus, and the CTMU, he inaugurated the only religion which opens the ethical and soteriological door to all of humanity with no threat or violence thereof, and thus qualifies as a universal, exemplar, and divinely certified leader of the faithful. If you are a masochist, does following the golden rule, to treat others how you would like to be treated, mean causing them suffering? By treat others how you want to be treated, we don't ever mean that if you enjoy pain, you should inflict pain on others. Instead, it's an expression of generalized utility. We can usually find out an ethically correct action using the empathy and moral reasoning of the golden rule. How you ought to treat someone is a bit more complicated than the golden rule, but the golden rule is the most basic and general expression of moral symmetry. Perhaps it should be treat others as though you love them. The The masochist, psychopath, etc., it's also important to note, does not escape judgment. We are all responsible for our actions, regardless of whatsoever disordered desires we have. Further, treating yourself like a psychopath would treat you is not empowering. It's disgusting, regardless of the excuses you tell yourself. Masochism does not follow the golden rule. There is an objective standard for morality. We are all responsible for our actions. The psychopath does not escape judgment. The masochist does not escape judgment. We all have disordered desires, but we need to get back to a place where we put God first and morality first. Is reality a giant terrarium? Depends on what you mean by that. Creation is a self-simulation by, for, and through ultimate reality. Reality is an identity operator that identifies with itself through the process of creation and then attributes existence to its own identity. In the CTMU, God is called the GOD, the global operator descriptor of this reality self-simulation. The internal logic of the self-simulation is through the metaformal system, an intrinsic language that reality uses to communicate with itself. You can go to megafoundation.substack.com to subscribe to the Mega Foundation teleologic newsletter and chrislangen.substack.com to subscribe to Chris Langen's Ultimate Reality. That is the most important thing you can do right now for the CTMU movement. Both will, as always, be linked in the description. Let the light shine forth in the darkness. May the peace of our Father in heaven be upon you. Like and subscribe. Peace.